All right, guys, thank you for that carrier update. We'll get one more before we are done here for the day. Right now, we are welcoming our Detroit Bureau Chief, Alan Adler, to the show. We're going to get into a little bit about the AV/EV Summit coming up next week. But before we get there, Alan, we've got an interesting story about Bosch and a pretty significant investment into alternative fuels that they're making. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, good morning, Kaylee and Michael. It is interesting because we just saw, and I do not think there's a direct connection, but we just saw the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which has a lot of money in it for alternative technologies around transportation, including hydrogen and fuel cells. This investment, of course, is not really directly related, simply because Bosch had said a couple of years ago, that it planned to spend about $1 billion globally on fuel cell development. It is a partner it has an arrangement with PowerCell to get the fuel cell stacks, and it's been working, interestingly enough, here they are again, Nikola, working with Nikola on providing fuel cell technology to them, which Nikola has actually licensed from Bosch. So having the U.S. production of fuel cell stacks is appropriate. It's a good supply chain story, I think, for Nikola and others, although Bosch is not naming the other customers right now.
It's interesting to see these type of investments. Does this mean that Bosch they're full on hydrogen, right? So this is a vote towards hydrogen and against pure battery or BEVs?
No, Michael, I don't think it's a either or for them. I think they'll approach any technology. They've got in their annual report, they lay out all kinds of plans around technologies, fuels, electrification, which of course hydrogen is a form of electrification. I think hydrogen is big for them. They're in the semiconductor space. They do a lot of things. I believe they're the world's largest automotive supplier at this point, and they are clearly looking at where the technology is heading. Fuel cells is an important one for them because they are working on them for where there are passenger cars. There aren't many, but where passenger cars are. But they've kind of leaned a little more into the commercial space, doing an electrification unit for tractor trailers, for reefers a couple of years ago, or signing an agreement with PowerCell to get that, kind of a downsized version of the fuel cell to do that. And they're, I think you're going to see them as a player. There's others, of course. I mean, Daimler and Volvo have a big fuel cell joint venture in Europe, and Bosch is supplying that with some of the componentry. So they're a major player across the range in fuel cells. This is just one that kind of brings it into a plant that already was doing some pretty complex electrification work, and adds 350 jobs, I think they said.
So, Alan, I'm interested in kind of what this move says about Nikola. Obviously, they're that partnership. Do we think that it's wise for companies like Nikola, who maybe started out betting big just on the battery electric side of things? They've got some diversification going on, putting some of their eggs into a different basket now of alternative fuels instead of just battery electric, like what Michael Vincent said. Do we see this kind of being almost more of a trend now, where you've got these companies who are saying, you know what, we're going all in on batteries, maybe backtracking, going, okay, we got to get a little bit different approach first?
Really, if you go back in time, Nikola was about doing hydrogen trucks. That was their first thing. The battery electric came later for them. They realized there was an opportunity, and so that's why the Nikola Tre, which means 3, really followed the now defunct Nikola 1, which is, of course, the subject of some of the trial coming up next week, actually, in New York for Trevor Milton. The Nikola 2, which I'm guessing is probably going to be renamed, to be honest with you, it may continue to call it Nikola 2, was always intended as a hydrogen truck, a sleeper cab, which is coming more like mid-decade now in terms of fuel cells. Nikola did go battery electric first, but it is always said that there would be a Nikola Tre version, cab over version of the fuel cell. So that's coming next year here. And interestingly enough, they're going to be introducing the European version at the IAA show in Germany, where we'll be next month, or this month, I should say, later this month in Hanover, Germany. So, hydrogen has always been the play for Nikola. Battery electric actually ended up being kind of a nice stopgap, really, while they got some of the work done in hydrogen. And of course, we talk all the time about the ups and downs the company's had.
So, Alan, I'm curious, does this bleed into other technologies or other applications of this, or is Bosch looking at that? Because when you look at hydrogen fuel cells, right? I mean, we call them fuel cells, and therefore you think, oh, automatically it's in with an engine, right? What about powering that reefer unit? What about a static fuel cells that are powering charging stations, like at homes, et cetera? And also even just commercial or private citizens with a Generac generator for emergency uses, hydrogen fuel cells. Is that why Bosch and those get into that? Is that bleed over technology into other areas?
Well, I'm sure that there's some of that. I mean, fuel cells make a lot of sense. All you have to do is look at Cummins and all the applications of fuel cells that they're doing, including now not just a couple, but a whole fleet of trains in Germany. They announced this week, and then you've got data centers that can be powered by fuel cell, stationary applications of fuel cells. And in terms of shrinking down the stack that is the basis of the fuel cell, before you add what's called, I think the term is balance of plant or something like that, basically the other parts. But they did do a downsized version for reefers, as I mentioned. I think the sky's the limit here. There is a tendency in our business to talk about fuel cell for transportation purposes, but there are other applications, like you said, and I think we'll probably see Bosch and Cummins and some of these others all go there. A lot of it depends on how you're going to power the hydrogen. If it's going to be so-called green hydrogen from renewables, right now most of the hydrogen is coming from basically fracking, if you will, natural gas, or splitting natural gas, and to take those elements from it. So it's really not something that is settled right now. But I think the idea is that the way to make hydrogen is one way anyway, is through an electrolyzer, and to use renewables for that, you get green hydrogen, and now you've got a much better story, whether it's a stationary fuel cell or whether it's used in transportation.
Alan, I love this story, and I love that we're seeing different people get into the transportation space with their technology. Let's swap gears a little bit and talk about next week's event. We've been kind of jokingly calling it the Alan Adler Show because it is truly up your alley. I think you've got 6 segments scheduled for our AV Summit, including our keynote speech. And this one it's going to be an interesting one for sure. It's one of my favorite events of the year.
Well, thank you for that. And I hope we'll stop calling it Alan Adler Day, because that's even somebody who's got an ego doesn't need that. So here's the thing. And you talked about our keynote, and Vince Cubbage, who is the head of Tortoise Acquisition, he's also the interim CEO at a company called Volta Charging right now. He would not be really a serial SPAC starter, but he does have 2 of them. Hyliion was one that he brought forward. Volta Charging was the second, and they're working on a third that they haven't identified a target for. But what we asked Vince to do is to sort of take us through a little bit of the history of SPACs, where they are now. He has an interesting take on this, which I had never considered in all the stories I've written over the last few years, is that one of the reasons we saw such a frenzy in SPAC activity was the pandemic, because things like roadshows that, investment banks and people starting, to try to companies public couldn't do that during the pandemic. So there was a lot of activity done on Zoom and on, meetings that were done, and things were pushed through that might have had more. It might have taken more time and maybe more diligence, if you were doing it in person. So it's one of his takes. He's got some other really interesting points on this. He's a veteran investment banker, as well as, again, in the SPAC space, and he's just been around the finance world for a long time. This is not a subject that I suspect every one of our viewers is going to connect with, but a lot of them will, because it underlies so much of what we've seen in the new companies in the autonomous space as well as electrification.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can't wait to see you in person in Freight Alley at the studios here. Maybe even a little bit of guest hosting on What the Truck there next Wednesday. I don't know.
I think we look great together. You're gonna have to take down the belt for the moment. I brought that up yesterday. But,
that definitely has to come down.
The stapler can stay. It's fine. Now that I understand what it is. But
That's
anyway, no, it's going to be great next week. We do have Don Burnett from Kodiak Robotics will be with us live next week, both for a fireside chat that we'll do, and then he'll be on one of your segments on What the Truck as well.
That's right.
We've got some really cutting edge stuff with Daniel Barrow from which is another startup that really has some fascinating approaches to medium duty trucking. Tim Reister from Lightning E-Motors will be talking with Jack Dalio next week. We've got we have. Oh goodness, I didn't have the list in front of me. We got a lot of good people. We really do. We also are going to hear from Snyder and from NFI, which are both early users of Class 8 electric trucks. They got a really sweet deal, quite honestly, in California because they paid for most of it. But we get their perspectives on what they've learned in that space. I think we're going to cover a lot of interesting stuff. So,
really everything from A to EV.
Oh,
I'm patenting that one.
okay.
All right.
Nicely done.
Thanks for
You need to
joining.
be in marketing, Kaylee.
I just make bad puns. That's
Wow.
Just keep up with that, huh?
it. We'll talk to you tomorrow for our edition of Truck Tech. And then, of course, we will see you next week here in the studio. Head on over to live.freightwaves.com to go and get registered for that AV Summit. It is currently free. Right now, we're going to head on over to Sydney Edwards. She's got our next check of our top stories this morning on freightwaves.com.